Thank you. Good morning. Thanks a lot for coming. I know it has been a very difficult 2 days, very full, but I think very good, and we are going to have also the discussion afterwards. So when Jaume asked me to participate at this workshop and he explained the topic, I thought that I have nothing to say. And actually, this is what I told him, that I have no idea how I can contribute to this so specific project on the promises of science. But I'm happy because he had an idea. He gave me some advice on how I can proceed in this. I was persuaded. I'm happy that I was persuaded. And when I started working on the paper, I realized that actually my project is all about promises of science. But I hadn't realized this. And I think what Jaume is doing to all of us, he invites us to think about promises as a new conceptual tool, as a way to understand the work that all of us are doing, and we are using different tools, different concepts to rethink our own projects and use this new designed tool, I would say, to understand what we are all doing. So what I plan to do today is two things. One is to discuss what is a promise, because if you want to design a new tool or if you want to use a new tool, you have to understand what kind of tool is this, what kind of concept we are invited to use. So I'm going to discuss a little bit this, and then I'm going to go into my own case study and elaborate some things related to the concept. So what is a promise? If you want to understand the concept, the first source you use is the philosophers. So I opened up, I went to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I found very similar things to what John presented the first day, that promise imposes moral obligations. So promises are very interesting concepts for ethical scholars, for ethical philosophers. And besides of being moral obligations, we already heard this, they are volunteer. I promise to marry you because I want to do this. And it's the only way this can be a promise. A promise produces trust, since when a promise is made, it's ought to be kept. So if I promise to marry you, I have to do it. Otherwise, it's not a moral obligation anymore. And this is a way to create a trustful relationship between the two of us. But through my own work, I realized that promises can also be contextual. What do I mean by contextual? I think of promise in two different areas. Let's say the politics and science. And think the time that we have national elections. All the candidates promise things, and they promise a lot, but usually they don't keep the promises. They don't deliver what they promise. They create expectations, but we have been, at least in Greece and I guess in other places and elsewhere, we have been very careful about trusting the promises of the politicians. But if you think promises in the realm of science, you don't react in the same way. When a scientist promises that he has found or she has found a new cure for a disease, we expect that he or she is going to keep this promise, or at least more than a politician. Promises are closely related to gender, and this will come up through the rest of my talk when I'm going to discuss my case study, and I'm going to elaborate more on this. Promises also work as promotional mechanisms. They are advertising tools. This is what I found through my own work. And again, this, you are going to see it in a little bit. And promises can be explicit or implicit. I like this promise, I'm going to marry you. It's a very explicit promise. But you might expect that I'm going to marry you because I have different ways to show you. Not very explicit, but there are many different ways to show something like this through the body language and through ways that you cannot really articulate through language. Also, promises can be textual or visual. This is what I found through my own work. It's not always that someone promises that he or she is going to do something in science, but there are other, through language, I mean, but there are other ways to do it, through images, and I'm going to show you some of these examples today. And promises also seem to be tied to the notion of seduction. Why this came to my mind? It came to my mind because recently I was reading a very interesting book that if we want actually to do something altogether on this idea of promises, we might want to take into account. It's called The Scandal of the Speaking Body. It's written by Susanna Fellman. She's a philosopher and literary critic. And in this book, she tries to combine ideas from 3 different fields: philosophy, literary studies, and psychoanalysis. And the main character in this book is Don Juan. And I found very interesting what she says here. She says the scandal of seduction seems to be fundamentally tied to the scandal of the broken promise. Don Juan is the myth of scandal precisely to the extent that it is the myth of violation. The violation not of women, but of promises made to them, in particular promises of marriage. So Feldman discusses the theory of promise that Austin has. I don't think that it's, we have enough time to elaborate on the philosophical approaches on promises, but I do really think that this is a good book that we might want to see if we want to proceed on this topic. And so looking through my own stuff, I realized that seduction is really a very important feature when we speak about promises in science. So what I'm going to discuss today is radium, as both a scientific object and as a commodity that has been used in 2 classes of applications throughout the first half of the 20th century. And these 2 different ways of using radium has not always been separate or distinctive enough. So the first one is that radium was used as an ingredient in all kinds of everyday products, from fertilizers to food and drinks to cosmetics and even cigars, amazing period. But as Lawrence Badas, the historian of science who has concentrated on the history of radioactivity, has termed this period of the early 20th century as radium craze because of this stuff that was happening. And the second application is in medicine. So it was used in medicine and presented either as a powerful agent in radium therapy by professional doctors or in patent medicines, and nostrum used by questionable practitioners. And remember, it's the time that physicians with charlatans are not distinctive categories. So I think that radium has been the promise of the early 20th century, and you can see this from the early on when it was actually discovered. These are some things that came up in the newspapers when journalists and reporters reported what scientists had to say about radium. So one of them in the New York Commercial Advertiser in 1904, he says, "For behold, liquid sunshine, meaning radium, has been discovered and will be presently on tap for the multitude, solving or simplifying almost all the problems of life." So it's a panacea, and actually it comes out as a title in many places. In 1904, there is an article called Nature's Panacea, meaning radium can do everything. And in 1913, Radium Elixir of Life. There is a question mark here, and there is a question mark here because there is the first time that something like this appeared in the American market. In 1912, a physician called Sigmund Sauberman devised what seems to be the first commercial emanator for domestic use in Berlin. Those were devices that produced radioactive water. So you had a tiny amount of radium inside, and when you put water in this, it turns into radioactive water, and so people were advised to drink this kind of stuff. And they were advised to drink this kind of stuff, especially men in this period, because as Sauberman claimed, radium emanations were supposed to promote rejuvenation and increase sexual desire and potency. So it becomes a huge issue in the beginning of the century. This device, as you can see, it describes as the only scientific apparatus for the preparation of radioactive water in the hospital or in the patient's own home, and is promoted both by physicians and also by other medical practitioners. And by the 20s, these kind of devices have become a common item in the American house. 1916, the American Medical Association discusses this new trend, but it doesn't discuss this new trend in order to avoid them or to refuse and advise people not to use them, but by saying that you need a stronger emanator and not a weak one. It says here, those who are well informed on the subject of radium therapy are of the opinion that the administration of small amounts of radium emanation, such as generated by certain outfits, is without therapeutic value. It has been stated that at the Radium Institute of London, the minimum preliminary dose is 185 microcuries, and as many as 555 microcuries are employed. So they are useful when they are strong. You have many kinds of these devices. One of the most known one is this Revigator. This is how it's advertised, the newest miracle of modern science. 1926, physician Everett Field explained that 27 companies were producing radium emanators of all kinds, making splendid profit, as he says. So it was a big business at the time. And he said, we speak of this experience not to support the people who advertise and sell such apparatus to the public, but to try to impress upon the medical man the fact that there is a real place for radium in his therapeutic armamentarium. I spoke about the ways that promises are closely related to gender, and you can find many advertisements like this. This is another radium emanator. It was called Vigor Radium, and you can obviously see how they connect the use of radium emanations to the new image of men and how masculine they should be. In 1929, the American Medical Association comes back to this issue, and they say the vendors capitalize suppressed wishes and desires and exploit all that the power of suggestion is able to do for the impotent. Rejuvenation has become a catchword for promoting radium emanators, and I think this is where we might want to use the notion of seduction and how the advertisements and how promises used to be a seductive tool during this period. This is one of the products I really like. They were radium suppositories. They had radium inside. And they were promoted, they were targeting sexually weak men who could bubble over with joyous vitality. This is what the advertisement said. And also the following, a man must be in a bad way indeed to sit back and be satisfied without the pleasures that are his birthright. Try them and see what good results you get. It's not the only one of this kind. You had only arium tablets, also radium tablets, and they were advertised very aggressively, especially this kind. And so men, again, especially men, were advertised to take 2 tablets with glass of water before or after each meal. To derive the most beneficial effects, arium should be taken regularly as directed. So this is what I think, looking through the advertisements and the relative pictures that I found, that arium tablets were made to appear scientifically approved, safe, and attractive by directly associating them with robust male figures whose masculinity was self-evident through the pictures, and I'm going to show you some. So the first step is to establish trust between the consumers and the people that produced this and marketed this. So here is a certificate that went with radium tablets, and here they argue that Marie Curie has certified the product. They even give a guarantee of $5,000, part of the act of establishing trust, I think. So they promise that when faithfully used as directed, are fully guaranteed to give satisfactory results in every case, or your money will be refunded. And again, remember that all this stuff was not used only by weird people or suggested by medical practitioners without degrees, but they were suggested also by the regular physicians of the time. So these are the kind of pictures you see in the pamphlet that goes with the product. So I think through all these pictures, the idea is to seduce the consumer. And so you have these pictures of before and after. Even today, when we see products advertised in this way. So the guy was weak, and after he takes the radium tablets, he becomes younger, stronger, and all this stuff. Look here. Arium helps restore active vital power and appearance of youth. Similar stuff, same pamphlet. I like this one, an older guy, and I actually say that if you are old, you still can enjoy younger women. And so you can enjoy by taking Arium. Same thing, take Arium knowing that it is going to help you. So all these promises, I think, are implicit promises and not so explicit as a philosopher could expect. I promise you that if you do this, this will happen. But it's all implicit, it's visual, and not only textual. What happens when Arium is promoted to women? Remember again my point about promises that are related to gender. So again, okay, if you're a woman and you take this, you become stronger, you become younger, but why? Not because you should enjoy your sexuality, but because you should become more functional within your own family. And very interesting comment, very common for this period, no longer need women fear those dread ailments peculiar to her sex, which drag her down, leaving telltale traces upon her face and figure. So all this discourse about women's disease, which is the menstruation. So when does all this change? And I think it changes when the promise, the initial promise that radium can be the panacea and the solution for everything seems impossible to be fulfilled. And it seems impossible to be fulfilled because you have a major event in the early 20s. I guess you know this Radium Girls scandal. They were the women that used to paint the dials of watches with radium paint. The paint contained radium-226 and mesothorium. So those women were paid by the piece. As many as watches they were able to complete through the day, they were paid, they were getting more money. So in order to speed up their work, they started leaking their brushes. So they were swallowing all this material. And this is what happened. So they started dying. 1922 is the first death that appears. And this is the images you get during this period, so terrible deaths. Newspapers, journals, magazines report the deaths even in the 40s and the 50s, so it becomes a huge thing. Radium victim number 41, there are so many that now don't go by their names, but by the number. So in 1929, the American Medical Association withdraws support for the radium emanators, and it says, in spite of many years of trial, acceptable evidence has not become available, and until such evidence does become available, the Council has decided not to accept generators for the production of water charged with radon or radium solution intended for intravenous use. What did happen? 2013. So long time passed, and in 2013, last year actually, I was finishing up my book on the radium economies, radium market. I think it will come out in 2015, early 2015, by Yale University Press. And so I advertised the book. And so I came across this thing, that radium, that physicians decided to come back to radium because all these years radium was not used in medicine anymore. And so the FDA approved a new drug. The Food and Drug Administration today, this is the announcement, approved Xofigo, I think this is how they pronounce it, radium-223, to treatment with symptomatic late-stage metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer, so men with prostate cancer that has spread to bones but not to other organs. It's intended for men whose cancer has spread after receiving medical or surgical therapy to lower testosterone. So in simple words, they produced this for men that had no hope. They had tried all they could to cure their prostate cancer, but they couldn't. This is how it looks. It's produced by Bayer. It's injected, and special personnel has to use it, and only in special centers you can get this kind of stuff. So what is a radiopharmaceutical? Because Xofigo is part of this radiopharmaceutical market, are agents used in the field of nuclear medicine as tracers in the diagnosis of certain medical problems or for the treatment of certain diseases. And Xofigo is the first radiopharmaceutical that emits alpha particles. What should we know about this market? What should we know about radiopharmaceuticals? It's a huge market. The radiopharmaceutical market has been estimated that it will exceed the value of $8 billion by 2018. The US is the biggest market, and Asia Pacific is forecast to emerge as the fastest growing market over the next 5 years. So big, very big business. The story of Xofigo's trial and manufacture, how we ended up having this stuff. It's interesting to see the dates. In June 2008, a study started. The original name of Xofigo was alfaradine. They used 921 patients. They were involved 136 study centers and in 19 different countries. The major physician is called Parker, and he's British. In September 2009, and although the study has not finished yet, Algeta, which is a Norwegian cancer therapeutic company, signs an agreement with Bayer for the production of alfaradine, 800 millions, dollars. This is what the CEO of the company is saying at this time. This agreement is the culmination of the extensive process to establish and deliver the best possible commercialization strategy for alfaradine. Keep in mind the study is not finished yet. In Bayer, we have selected a world-class oncology company with a proven global track record of launching major cancer products. We are very excited about working with the Bayer team to deliver this novel and potentially first-choice treatment for cancer patients with bone metastasis. Bayer is committed to its global oncology franchise, and she has made significant progress in building a comprehensive pipeline of promising compounds that may provide innovative therapies to cancer patients in need of treatment. So many implicit promises here. 2011, it's the time that the study ends. 2012, the research team reports the first results in conferences. They had signed an agreement with Algeta and Bayer that they cannot report earlier. May 2013, it's the time that the FDA approved Xofigo. We saw this earlier. And the agency reviewed the drug under a fast-track priority program, and they even did this much earlier. They approved it 3 months before even they finished the fast track. And in July 2013, Parker, the major physician, publishes the study. So 2 months later than the approval. This is the announcement. the language that FDA uses is very, very careful, so no real promise from their part. Although they published in July 2013, a month earlier, 2011, Algeta opens up a commercial production facility for Xofigo at the Institute for Energy Technology in Norway, and only 1 month after it has been approved. You cannot be that fast. So how promises become forward-looking statements? Instead of having, at least in the language that Bayer uses and Algeta uses, there are many promises, but they are very careful on how they promise now. And instead of having a special sections headed as promises, they use this new term, forward-looking statements. This news release contains certain forward-looking statements. They had already said how good Xofigo is, what it can do, how much important it is. And so they say now that these statements are based on uncertainty as they relate to events and depend on circumstances that will occur in the future and which, by their nature, may have an impact on results of operations and the financial condition of Algeta. Such forward-looking statements reflect our current views and are based on the information currently available to Algeta. So they are really very careful. Algeta cannot give any assurance as to whether such forward-looking statements will prove to be correct. And they continue in this kind of discourse. So why, despite the current availability of number of radiopharmaceuticals, radium is the first time after more than half a century that appears in the medical market with high promises? I found the answer in one of the publications during this time. I'm not going to read it all. I want to leave some time for discussion. So I think this is the most important part, where they say historically safety concerns were further fueled by horror stories that included lost radium sources that underwent accidental heat sterilization, vaporization, and closed down entire hospitals. And they also go on to discuss the Radium Girls scandal. So they actually say that because of these incidents, they were so late to reuse radium again in medicine. And so I know one of these old medical physicists that used to try to collect all these weird devices in the 90s, 80s, and 90s. And so he wasn't aware last year that this was going on with Xofigo. And so I sent him an email saying what is going on, because also I wanted to find out where they find radium, where Algeta finds radium now, because you don't go to the groceries to buy radium. You have to get into a very specific mechanism. And so I thought that he might know. He didn't, and he said, what a lovely turn of events. After years of encouraging the cessation of use of radium-226, we now save it to make radium-223 for medical purposes. Medical radium is back. And so you can see I got the title of my talk from his comment. So I think it's a very interesting story if you start looking this story through the concept of promise. How radium was promised as the panacea, how an incident changed our minds about this, and how we now come back very carefully to this stuff. And we change our language, and instead of promises, companies use different kind of ways to seduce us. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria. We have a quarter of an hour for discussion, so please, Katie.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was really interested in the gendered advertisements, as we were chatting before about the comparison with electrical cure adverts in a similar period. And I'm just curious to know whether radium itself was gendered as an agent, because Graham Gooday has looked at the promises and the threats of electricity in the home and how these were managed, and sometimes electricity became a sprite that was either female or androgynous. So I'm just curious about that with radium.
I don't go so far. and I'm not sure what it means to say that radium is gendered. My idea, and through the study I have done, is that radium-based products were really gendered products. So you have, and it's not only the stuff that I show you, there is more. For example, they use radium in cosmetics. They don't care about women's sexuality during this period. They care about how women look like. So this is why they promote Arium. This is why they promote the cosmetics. But I cannot say that radium itself can be gendered. I'm not sure what this can mean.
Thank you very much. So I found it really surprising that radium just so completely goes away from medicine, and really interesting. But there are, of course, all sorts of other isotopes that people are using for medical purposes. And I was wondering to what extent the story of radium is kind of something they have to deal with, and to kind of address the safety. So it's no longer the stage of innocence, as it were. But you start from the idea that this is dangerous poison that we can still harvest, and that's kind of what's happening with this company as well.
You mean how this influences the use of other radioisotopes?
Yeah,
or
I guess that'd be.
Actually, I think one of the reasons that they turn to other radioisotopes is because of the failure of radium at this period, and because it becomes such a big issue. I mean, this Radium Girls scandal, and it's not the only one. There is another big story about Radithor. I'm not sure whether you are familiar with this story. There is a tonic. Instead of having these devices at home to produce radioactive water, you just go to the market and buy a bottle with radioactive water. Actually, it was a radioactive water inside. It was called Radithor. It was suggested by physicians, prescribed by physicians. And there is a very famous guy. He's an industrialist. And so after using this for a year, he was advised to drink 2 bottles a day. After using this for a year, he dies. And actually, not only him, but some of his friends die, because he was very generous to give them this stuff. He was so excited in the beginning. So it becomes a big scandal. And not only, again, the Radium Girls scandal, but his case as well. And actually, because he's so powerful, he has a lot of money. So the interest, the initial interest, was about his case and not about the women in the industry. So you have 2 major cases in the 20s. And this is why they stopped using, I think, radium. And this is why in medicine they became more careful and they turned to radioisotopes. It's not only this, of course. There are many other reasons that we turn to radioisotopes. After the Second World War, things become more easy by using radioisotopes. And so the whole scenery with radioactivity is changing after the war. And I'm not sure I answer your question, but the use of radioisotopes instead of radium is connected, I think, to these failures.
So are they seen as inherently safer?
I'm sorry?
Are they seen as safer by their
Radioisotopes?
Yeah.
Yes. Radium-226 is very strong. The half-life is 1,600 years, so it's a long time. And radium-223 has a half-life of 11 days. So this is why now they come back to radium, but they are very careful from many different directions.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk and for the. And I actually wanted to follow up on that because, and then I have another question, but because it sounds as if I go now outside to the street and ask the people whether they know the difference between radium and a radioactive isotope, I don't think many will know. Mm-hmm. So I'm surprised that radium becomes this thing that you will not talk about anymore and you will not try to sell anymore to the public. But there seems to be a different reaction against radioisotopes, which we all know that every time we have a scan or one of these whatever things, they inject the thing in us. So I wonder how even the word radioisotope is not changed just to avoid the word radium at all in this story you told us.
2 things I can think about. First, even if you went out here in the 20s and 30s talking about radium, they could not know anything. Or at least they could not know the stories that they knew in the US. So this is why I said in the beginning that promises are contextual. So this is why I said that promises are contextual. It's a different place. I mean, in the US, the story became too big, actually, because there were industries in New York, in Chicago, in many other places. The radium industry was really big, and so it was national news, and everyone knew about this story. So this is something very strong, and I think there is a memory, and it's not by chance that when this Xofico story comes up, the scientists feel the need to explain why they come back. And as I showed you, and there are other places where you can see this more obviously, they try to say it's not Curie's radium. Actually, there is a title in one of the papers that we are not going back to Curie's radium, but now it's a different kind of radium. And as I said, of course, there are other issues that come into play. Radioisotopes become very important after the war. And so they have ways to treat several diseases without going back to radium. But I think the main reason that they do go back, the other thing is that it's not easy to find radium. This is the other thing that we haven't discussed. I mean, as I said, you don't go out and get radium. In 2004, I was at the Vienna Institute, the Radium Institute in Vienna, and they still had bottles with radium salts in the basement. And the physicists there told me that they are not going to stay there for long because someone was asking for this in Britain. That was in 2004, no sign yet for this story, so nobody knew that they were preparing all this. And so the story goes back to the beginning of 2000, I think. So it's not very easy to find radium in the market. And they had to deal with this. When I sent an email to the company in Algeta and asked where they find the radium and how much they pay, because these were really important issues in the beginning of the century. They didn't respond. I mean, they said, we cannot tell.
No, and then there's another thing I wanted to, just no, because it's more common to trigger the discussion later. I'm very grateful you went to the Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy.
John did as
well. And I would challenge the thing that if you want to understand something, go to the philosophers, but that's a different thing.
Okay.
No, but no, the thing of the contextual promises, because in coarse grain, you might think, okay, the promises are always the same kind of health or youth or power or wealth. But here you showed us very nicely how even when it comes to health, it's a different kind of health, the one of the women in the 1920s to perhaps a woman today. So I think that will be interesting to
and also think about how politicians promise about health and how scientists promise about health. So there is a big difference there.
So there are a few more questions, so at least three, so I hope we have two of them at least, and the third if we have time. I just would add one thing, is that I think one word that was missing but was there is threat. So we have the promise and the threat in your talk.
Thank you very much. That's a fascinating talk. I'm very interested in how promises end, because I think this is a question that has been touched on by some of the talks. So, for example, Antonio yesterday with Decode told us a story, how it ended all up in haste and waste and a scandal of sorts. So I was wondering whether you're maybe willing to generalize about how promises end. Here we have two consequences in the radium story. We have, first of all, the withdrawal of medical support, which seems to be quite rapid after the scandal of the radium dial women. And then secondly, you have a scandal. And the implication of your introduction was that maybe scandal was a general feature of broken promises. So would you be willing to speculate or generalize about how promises end? Is scandal, for example, a typical result of broken promises?
Thank you very much for this question, because I think, maybe all is here, but I didn't think it in the way that you phrase it. So you're right. It's all about how promises end. I haven't thought about this. It reminds me of how experiments end. It's the same idea. We decide to end something. So maybe, but I'm not in the position to generalize, and I think this is part of the work that we have to do here. But how to promises end depends on our case studies and whether we are willing to show this. But it's a very good direction to go. It's not here. You saw it, but I wasn't conscious that it is here. So thanks a lot for this.
Yes, thank you, Maria. I want to elaborate a bit further on this. I think what is also part of your story that you did not touch upon so explicitly was the willingness of the general audience to accept those promises. So there's a general belief, well, something that is new in science must be good, or must be special. And, well, this is the newest thing, so it must be good. And it also shows that, well, science is this duality. It might also be very dangerous and strange and doing things to your body that you don't want to have. So, but in general, so it is amazing, of course, that this is accepted. I mean, you can. It's not just a story of making nice graphs of man with potency and so on. There's more. So there's this general belief of, well, yeah, science must bring special things. So this is science, so it is special.
You are right. I think it goes together with the idea that science is so powerful, especially in the beginning of the century. And whatever is scientific, we tend to believe that it's a good thing. So I think it fits in this general story. And if you concentrate on the radium stuff, on the radium products that were marketed during this period, you can see that they made a lot of effort to persuade the audiences. They used all new tools of the time. Advertising is a new tool. Radio and leaflets. I mean, they used whatever was available at this time to persuade. And it's a lot of money. It's a market that has money. It's like the radiopharmaceuticals of this time. So they have the ability to do it. For example, the company that produces cosmetics, Radium Cosmetics, hires a very known journalist of the time, and they pay her in order to write articles in New York Times about how good this stuff is. So you see that they use tools that we use today, and we accept them as normal. But it is the beginning of the century, and you have a good point there that the side of the audience and the consumers is a very important side.
We have time for the last question.
Okay, this is in a sense not so much a question as something that points towards a discussion later, but your paper very nicely encapsulated something that's been bothering me about this idea of promise, because the adverts and so on are promises in the sort of what the philosophers were saying there, a moral. You take this radium, it will make you better. But then later on, you had that phrase there. These are promising developments, or something like that. And I said, isn't the word promising there very, very different? I mean, a promising development, you aren't saying this is definitely going to make you better. You're just saying this looks as though it might be a good idea, but we've got to sort it out. And I think a lot of the articles, future-looking articles I was talking about in the magazines I dealt with, are in that context of promise. They're not making firm promises, they're saying this looks pretty good, if this carries on it might be okay for us. So there's a very different meaning of the word promise there, is there not?
That was part of the argument. The thing that you refer to is from the new stuff in 2013. So although before you had all these interesting images, now that you promote this Xofigo drug, you are very careful. You speak about promising compounds. And Algeta, as I saw you, they have a special section about forwarding statements or whatever. So I think this is part of what we also have to discuss, that the language changes, that we have to be more careful now. we have to cover our backs because maybe Alzeta ends up in a court because of whatever happens. So I think this changes, and we have to seek promises in the historical context that we discuss them. And I guess, speaking about pictures, I guess in your stuff, you must have seen similar things for your topic. I mean, it's the time that images play a huge role. It's not only the text, but the images as well, which we lose today. So the only photograph of Subido that I found was this one. And I couldn't find any photograph of a nurse, for example, injecting the drug, something that was very common in the early period. So even the visual part changes, not only the textual.
So thank you very much, Maria, for this interesting talk and lively discussion.
Thank you.
And we move to our second speaker, Robert Budd from the Science Museum in London. Robert worked for many years on connections between science, technology, biotechnology in the early 90s already. And I think that this talk today will also be connected to that and the place of promise there.